If you ever discovered a GPS tracker secretly attached to your car, what would your first reaction be? Most people wouldn't hesitate for even a second. They'd pull it off immediately, maybe even toss it away without thinking twice. But here's where things get complicated, because what if that suspicious device you just ripped off your vehicle actually belonged to the police? And what if that simple reaction suddenly turned you from a confused citizen into a criminal suspect? That's not a hypothetical scare tactic. It has actually happened. Real people, real police surveillance, and real criminal charges that followed. And in one case, it went so far that the issue ended up shaping how police across the entire country are allowed to track vehicles today. So the real question is this: if you find a police GPS tracker on your car, is it illegal to throw it away? Could you be arrested for it? Or are you completely within your rights to remove it and walk away? Because this isn't just about privacy anymore. It's about what the law considers theft, what counts as police property, and whether you are expected to cooperate with surveillance you never agreed to in the first place. To understand how serious this gets, we need to start with a real situation involving a woman named Tiara Beverly. One ordinary day, Tiara Beverly had no idea anything unusual was going on. That changed when 5 Louisiana State police officers showed up at her home asking questions about someone she knew. Nothing criminal was alleged against her. Nothing was explained in detail, just routine questioning that felt strange but not alarming on its own. But things took a sharp turn just 2 days later. While outside her apartment, she noticed unfamiliar men hanging around her parked car. At first, it didn't seem like much, but as she paid closer attention, she saw one of them move under her vehicle. It looked like he was attaching something to it. Now imagine that moment for a second. You're not told anything, you don't know who these people are, and suddenly something is being placed under your personal car without your consent. Is it a bomb? A tracking device? Something else entirely? Tiara didn't wait to find out. Once she got a chance to look underneath her vehicle herself, she discovered it was a GPS tracking device. And like most people would, she removed it immediately. But instead of destroying it or hiding it, she placed it on a nearby utility pole. The device still worked, it simply wasn't moving anymore. At that moment, she didn't know it yet, but this decision would trigger a legal chain reaction, because before law enforcement even realized their surveillance had stopped tracking her car, Tiara contacted the local NAACP for guidance and support, and soon after, police discovered something unusual: their GPS device was no longer moving. That's when they reached out, demanding the return of their tracking equipment. Tiara's response was simple and sharp. If they wanted it back, they could go find it on the utility pole themselves. Now pause here for a moment, because this is where the legal tension begins. Was she supposed to return it? Could she even be accused of stealing it? Or was she simply removing something placed on her private property without permission? You might assume the answer is obvious, but another case showed that police were willing to push this argument much further. That second case involved a man named Derek Hearing in Indiana. In Derek's situation, police already suspected him of drug-related activity. Unlike Tiara's case, they did obtain a warrant before placing a GPS tracker on his SUV. For about a week, everything went exactly as law enforcement expected. The device transmitted his location, and the investigation moved forward smoothly. Then suddenly, the signal stopped. From the police perspective, there was only one explanation: Derek must have found the tracker and removed it. But instead of simply accepting that and moving on with the investigation, the situation escalated in a surprising way. Police didn't just assume the device was gone. They went further and told a judge that Derek had committed theft. Their argument was unusual. The GPS tracker belonged to the government, and by removing it and failing to return it, Derek had intentionally exercised control over government property. That, they claimed, was enough to treat it as theft. Think about how strange that sounds. A person finds an unfamiliar device attached to their vehicle. There's no label, no instruction, no warning saying police property, please return if found. Just a hidden object under their car. And yet, the claim was that removing it could make them a criminal. But there was another motive behind this accusation. It wasn't really about recovering the device. It was about getting a search warrant. Using the theft allegation, police convinced a judge to issue a warrant to search Derek's home. When they executed that warrant, they didn't just find the GPS tracker. They also discovered drugs and paraphernalia, which seemed to validate their suspicions. On the surface, that might look like a successful investigation, but the legal system didn't stop there. The case eventually reached the Indiana Supreme Court, and the justices had to confront the core issue. Does removing a GPS tracker from your own vehicle automatically prove theft? The court pointed out something very important that often gets overlooked. A device like that can fall off on its own. It can malfunction. It can be removed by someone else who isn't the owner of the vehicle. And even if the driver did remove it, that alone doesn't prove criminal intent. Because theft isn't just about possession, it's about intent. And in this case, there was no clear evidence that Derek ever intended to steal anything. He simply removed an unknown object from his own property. The court rejected the argument. They ruled that removing a GPS tracker under these circumstances was not enough to establish theft. And because that theft claim was the foundation for the search warrant, the warrant itself became invalid. Everything that came after it, including the evidence discovered in the search, was thrown out. Derek ultimately avoided conviction, but the case revealed something important. Before court stepped in, police were actively using GPS tracker removals as a legal workaround to justify searches, and the justification they often leaned on was surprisingly simple. They argued that anyone driving on public roads has no real expectation of privacy in their movements. After all, other drivers can see you. Pedestrians can see you. Police officers can observe you. So if your location is already visible, why would it matter if a device tracks the same information? That question didn't stay theoretical for long. It eventually reached the United States Supreme Court in the landmark case, United States versus Jones. In that case, a man named Antoine Jones became the target of a drug investigation. Police had obtained a warrant to place a GPS tracker on his vehicle. But there was a problem. The warrant expired before they actually installed the device. Despite that, officers went ahead anyway. They installed the tracker 11 days after the warrant had expired, and did so in a jurisdiction where the authorization wasn't valid. Then, they tracked Jones for nearly a month, collecting detailed information about his movements. When the case reached court, the government argued something very similar to earlier reasoning. Jones had no reasonable expectation of privacy because he was traveling on public roads. Anything he did in public could be observed anyway. But Jones's legal team shifted the focus entirely. They didn't argue about visibility. Instead, they argued about physical intrusion. Their point was simple but powerful. Police physically attached a device to private property in order to gather information. That act itself, they argued, is what triggers Fourth Amendment protection. And the Supreme Court agreed. The court ruled that physically placing a GPS tracker on a vehicle is considered a search under the Fourth Amendment. Justice Sotomayor emphasized that a search occurs when the government violates a reasonable expectation of privacy that society recognizes as legitimate. That decision changed everything. From that point forward, law enforcement was required to obtain a valid warrant before attaching GPS tracking devices to vehicles. No shortcuts, no retroactive justification, proper authorization first. On paper, that sounds like a strong protection, but the reality is more complicated, because even though warrants are required, many people assume that means a judge has carefully reviewed all the evidence and made a detailed, thoughtful decision. In practice, that's not always how it works. A warrant does not necessarily mean strong proof of a crime exists. Often, it's based heavily on an officer's statement rather than extensive evidence review. And in many cases, warrants are approved extremely quickly, sometimes within minutes. There are situations where officers present multiple warrants at once, and judges approve them almost automatically, without asking detailed questions. Legally, the standard is probable cause, but probable cause is not a high bar. It's a threshold, not a conclusion. So while the Supreme Court decision did introduce a warrant requirement, it didn't eliminate GPS tracking. It simply added a procedural step. Instead of placing a tracker first and justifying it later, police now get approval first and then proceed with the same surveillance methods. Which raises a bigger question. Has anything really changed in practice? Because GPS surveillance hasn't slowed down. In fact, with advancing technology, it has only become easier, more precise, and more common. And that brings us back to the original question. What should you actually do if you find a GPS tracker on your car? The answer isn't the same everywhere. Laws differ depending on the state, and different courts may interpret similar situations differently. One key factor is who placed the device. Was it law enforcement, a private investigator, a stalker, an ex-partner? That detail alone can completely change the legal outcome. So before taking any action, understanding local law is important. But speaking generally, if someone were in that situation, the first instinct many people would have is to remove the device. And courts have already suggested that simply removing a GPS tracker from your own vehicle does not automatically make it theft or tampering. After that, the situation becomes more practical than legal. Many people would consider disposing of the device or disabling it, while also taking steps to ensure there are no additional trackers hidden elsewhere on the vehicle, because multiple devices can sometimes be used at once without the driver realizing it. That's why checking thoroughly matters. Finding one tracker doesn't guarantee it's the only one. And finally, one of the most important steps would be seeking legal advice immediately, because whether the tracking is coming from law enforcement or someone operating illegally, the presence of a device suggests that some form of surveillance or investigation is already happening, and that leads to an even bigger concern, because GPS trackers are only one method of surveillance. Technology has moved far beyond that, and in some cases, even your phone can be used to track you in ways most people don't realize. But that's a whole other conversation, one that reveals just how far modern surveillance has really gone.